Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at the Oregonian. Today, I'm with Travis Williams, the executive director of Willamette Riverkeeper. It's a nonprofit whose mission is to protect and restore the Willamette River, and not just in Portland, but throughout the entire river basin. And today, we're going to talk about a complicated topic, the impact of homeless encampments on the river and its ecosystem. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Travis. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me.
You bet. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. For starters, I want to give our listeners a little background. I've been reporting for weeks now on this impact of homeless encampments on Portland's natural areas. And by this, I mean wild, often remote areas that are protected, that are deemed important habitat for salmon, other fish and animals, areas that carry out functions like flood protection, fire mitigation, and stormwater management. Many of these areas, especially on Portland's east side, have been significantly damaged by the encampments, and we're going to talk about specifics in a moment. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that our city is facing a housing crisis of unprecedented proportions. There are thousands of people who are forced to survive on the streets, and they have literally nowhere to go because there are not enough shelter beds. There's a severe shortage of affordable housing, and many people can't afford the skyrocketing rents. And then there's also city policies that have dictated where people can and cannot camp and have shaped our approach to addressing homelessness. So, with that in mind, let's dive in. No pun intended. Uh, Travis, your group has done cleanups on the Willamette River for many years. Can you tell us what these cleanups look like and when you started seeing an uptick in the amount of trash you've encountered in and around the river?
Yeah, thank you. So river cleanups are not a new um, activity by any group that cares about water quality and habitat on a given river or lake or bay. We've been doing them for years, periodically, but on a regular basis, and certainly over time, there have been areas that are prone to people illegally dumping and doing that type of activity. But I think there has been a significant transformation in the past few years, if not longer than that, of having more and more people living in and around the Willamette River and some of its tributaries, which in some cases, not all, but in some cases results in camps being abandoned, or dump piles being created by those camps that ultimately end up adjacent to the river in the riparian zone. That's the vegetated zone near the waterway. Um, and sometimes that material has also ended up in the water itself. And so, due to that, initially it was just a few areas in our urban areas along the Willamette. So, obviously, you're talking about Portland, you're talking about Salem and Kaiser and Albany and Corvallis and Eugene and Springfield. And those would, sort of developed, I would say, sporadically, and we identified those with our volunteers and staff over time, until we reached the point where it became a very regular activity to have to go in and clean up individual sites, over and over and over and over again. So that's kind of some, the background context for us, and I would also say that it's not something that we want to be doing.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, where things are now, it's kind of a reality that if we and others don't get down into some of these areas and clean them up, there can be human health impacts. There can be impacts on the ecological health of the river, and certainly related to that, all the wildlife that we find along the Willamette and its tributaries.
Mhm. And when you say cleanups, you mean you're going both from the river itself on boats and also wading in?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a very physical endeavor that takes oftentimes a lot of logistics to gain access to areas that might only be reachable or are in some cases best reachable by a powerboat or a canoe or a kayak or a drift boat. Um, Certainly, there are areas that we can access by land, and that's great. It's easier logistically. It still takes a lot of time and effort. And then we go into those areas with volunteers who we train for this purpose, or who are at least willing to go out there with us and get some training about safety and what to pick up and what not to pick up. But we'll go down into those areas right along the river and upland from the river and literally remove material. Um, and that has a variety of forms, but it's a very labor intensive endeavor. It takes a lot of time. And I think for any organization, whether you're a contractor for a city or you're some other municipal staff or your nonprofit staff, it can really, it gets to you. It's a lot of effort. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but there's also, a component here that is a larger social component that we have to be aware of, and we're kind of trying to balance all of that. And for us, it's really
Hmm.
about you know trying to protect water quality and to protect habitat within this larger societal issue that we're seeing.
Hmm. Absolutely. And so you've been seeing more of these encampments and more trash in the river and alongside the riverbanks. Where have where has your organization seen people camping, and under what condition?
Yeah. Typically there are areas that give someone just enough space to pitch a tent that's adjacent to the water, that, let's say, for the nicer part of the year, nicer weather part of the year, which typically can correspond with lower river flows. So you're not having the river rise up and get into these camps until later. Um, Folks are positioned generally immediately adjacent to the water or not far off. Some of these low and floodplains are areas that are the first step up onto land, typically, that are low lying areas that stretch outward for, in the best case scenario, many meters. Um, or they can be smaller than that if you're in an area that's constrained by, an upland geologic form, if you will. So that can really dictate where people can get to. But the larger point is that folks are finding areas that they can access that are typically set aside for parks and for wildlife and natural areas. And if they are out of the way a little bit, we find people will find ways to get there. And oftentimes those areas are more, they seem to be more attractive to folks. And I think
Hmm.
those reasons are easy to understand. You
Right.
don't want to be, on the side of a road that we see too often in Portland and elsewhere in the Willamette Valley. If you can get a little bit off the track and have a place that's relatively peaceful, I totally understand why people would want to camp there. But that's where we're finding them. Um, and that has been a pretty consistent theme for, going back a decade.
Hmm. Hmm. And a lot more in the recent years since the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly.
And I should add that a few weeks ago, you and I went walking alongside the river bank. We started out at around Ross Island Bridge, and we're walking towards Oaks Crossing and Oaks Park, and we saw people. Uh, they were hidden, so we had to look. But down the riverbank, we saw both sort of single campsites and then also multiple people camping together right at the edge of the river. And I should add that the water was pretty high at that time. So that was kind of a surprise to me. I mean, is that something that you've seen before?
Yeah, we've seen that a lot. And that area along Holgate Channel there across from Ross Island has been, you might call it a hot spot. But it's a place that's a little bit off the beaten track, like we were talking before. And if there's just a few feet, enough to plant a small tent, you there's a chance people will be in areas like that. And of course, the difficulty arises when you look at, what are they doing with their materials? What are they doing with their waste? And really, how is that any way somebody should be trying to live in this day and age? And I think we should all answer that with the answer being no.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, you've got a strip of land there that is attractive for a variety of reasons to folks. And What has typically happened is that people, for a variety of reasons, will vacate those camps and literally leave their garbage, their refuse, their human waste in some cases, and everything else that's associated with a camp.
Hmm.
And with the variability of water rising and falling, depending on what's happening with weather and seasonally, that's where we see real potential impacts to water quality and wildlife in those areas.
Yeah, and that's what we saw when we went walking along the river that time. That there was a lot because the water was so high. I mean, there were literally a few encampments that were underwater, tents and all, and there was tons of trash in the water,
Yep,
just floating there at the edge of the river, because
exactly.
people must have left quickly and left everything behind. You mentioned just right now a few of the impacts and. Can you tell us specifically what kind of trash and other things you have found while doing these cleanups in the water and next to the water?
Yeah, well, and I would say this, and it's really kind of depressing, but we've seen it all. If you can imagine something along the riverside, there's a likelihood that we've seen it, and we've tried to deal with it, or we've dealt with it. And when I say dealt with it, we've removed it or figured out a way to have someone else remove certain types of material. The camps will have everything from food wrappers and used cans to camping fuel and everything you might associate with buying from an outdoor store, broken apart or ground into the beach or into the soils. You see clothing in the same condition, wet, sogging, ground into the turf and into the beach, hanging from trees. You'll see tents, both broken and usable. Some tents, somebody might have filled them with trash for whatever reason. We've seen that. Um, and so honestly, it's anything you can imagine somebody might try to acquire to help themselves, or maybe they're involved in some kind of commerce with certain, bike parts and things
Mhm.
of that nature. We have over time seen quite a bit of that, but it's not to boil it down to one type of person or circumstance in those
Mhm.
situations. Everybody's there for, I think, a combination of related reasons, and there's probably a continuum, if you will, between mental health and addiction and hard luck and anything else that kind of goes into that human equation. So,
Right.
and we've seen these folks, we've seen them and talked to them and interacted with them, and again, all of our folks are trained in how to interact if we get in situations where we find camps that are occupied. Our rule of thumb is not to go into camps that are occupied and tell them that they have to leave or anything like that. We're really looking for places that are clearly vacated, or in some cases, if a camper flags us down and says, "Hey, I do have some trash and debris you can take," we'll take that.
Mhm.
And sometimes you learn a bit about them, learn their names, you get their story, and oftentimes they will volunteer to us that they're trying to get out of it. They're just not sure exactly how that's supposed to work.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's the case for many people. The trash that you're finding and the other things that you're finding on in the river, in the water, or next to the water. Why is this such a problem? What are the impacts? How is it impacting? Whether the water quality or the animals. Give us a few specific examples.
Yeah. So, the Willamette has been beleaguered over the decades, and you could read, there's a lot of material out there on the internet about, whether you're looking at Portland sewer overflows or the impact of dams on the Willamette River system, which has been significant, and many other things that relate to a variety of types of pollution. But when we see this issue, we do see a direct correlation with impacts to populations of birds and mammals and fish that are home at home on the Willamette. That if you look at the discharge of material from a riverbank, whether it's small particles of plastic that can be ingested by a range of species, and again, these are things we see regularly in some of the vacated camps. Um, we also see fuel that gets spilled into the river, and we've seen a variety of ways that that can happen, whether it's camp fuel or other types of fuels that are brought into a given site. Strands of synthetic fiber that get caught on a beak of a bird or ingested by waterfowl. A couple of years ago, I was actually paddling near Eugene, and here was a great blue heron that seemed to be kind of off in its behavior. And I paddled up to it, and lo and behold, there was a significant chunk of synthetic fiber hanging from its beak, and it could not get this fiber off. Um, and I helped it. It actually worked. I
Mm,
had faint hope that I could help this bird, but I was able to actually get a stick in near its beak and just
mm,
flick that material hard enough where that, in combination with the bird trying to get away from me, frankly,
mm, mhm,
it freed it up and it flew off squawking. But that was I guess one little victory in this type of thing.
mhm,
And then we think about the thousands and thousands of invertebrates, like freshwater mussels that are nestled in the river bottom in different parts of the Willamette. Anything that we send, whether it's fuel or fiber or plastic, creatures like that have to filter the water, and they can't swim away, and they're typically fixed in one place. And keeping in mind too that some of these freshwater mussels, the western pearl shell, for example, can live to be over 100 years old. So when you start to look at impacts like that, and not necessarily measuring classic water quality standards like bacteria, dissolved oxygen, and temperature, while those are important, this is another layer of um, potential impacts that can affect an array of species. And then,
mhm.
honestly, in some cases, you look at human health, you look at the types of materials that might be left along a riverbank, and somebody who may not notice a sharp object that's left there and can step on it or otherwise come into contact with it, that could be detrimental as well.
Mhm. So it makes the river less accessible to humans as well,
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I
too.
mean, it's an accessibility issue. It's a peace of mind issue, and in some cases, it can be a very real, a potential injury issue.
Mhm, mhm. And it occurs to me, as sort of the big picture. This river is, it, it's an important part of Portland. We're a port city. It's kind of symbolic, and it's what's happening to the river is a kind of a microcosm of what's happening to our entire city. So these impacts, it's not just the river that's seeing them, obviously, but many other natural areas and many other areas of our city are seeing this crisis and its impacts.
Yeah, and it's an interesting when you compare, societal issues with homelessness and houselessness. That, frankly, from my position, having grown up in the Portland area, I find it's really kind of tragic. And, you know, I think a lot of times people like to point fingers, and, blame people for one thing or another. But I think we have to approach all this with a very thoughtful and humane um, position, and try to move forward and try to work for positive change. And I think in our case too, it's interesting because my sense is that the city of Portland, as an entity, city government, but also others, have kind of a certain detachment from the Willamette. And there's certainly contingents of folks that like to swim in it, but if we really look at it, and I shouldn't just say swim in it, paddle it, do birding, walk the riverside. But when we really look at how the city of Portland interfaces with the Willamette River as a quote unquote river city, I think it pales in comparison to other cities around the United States. And um, I think to some degree, we've rested on our laurels environmentally, and socially in some ways. And the fact that we have this situation and it has taken so long, and it's been exceedingly difficult to coordinate with the city and some other entities, frankly, trying to work on the same issue. There's been, I think, a lot of frustration on our part and on behalf of other organizations we've heard about who are trying to work on these issues. certainly the frustration abounds. But I think,
Yeah.
this could also represent an opportunity for people to really reconnect with the river, to remember everything we've worked for water quality and for healthy habitat, and to kind of move in a way that helps us deal with this houseless and homelessness issue and camping along the Willamette, and continue to make investments in green infrastructure and healthy habitat all along the river.
Hmm. Yeah, these are great points. And I want to look at a little bit about this issue of inaction and why it's taken so long for the government to address this issue. One of the challenges that you mentioned when you and I talked was that the challenge of jurisdiction, the fact that these riverbanks belong to a variety of actors. Can you talk a little bit about who the land belongs to or who manages it, and why is this such a problem when it comes to solving this problem?
Sure. And it depends on where you are in the Willamette Basin. In the Portland area, you could be, let's go back to that example of Holgate Channel. There's land ownership there by the city of Portland. There's land ownership right adjacent to it by the Metro regional government. And there's also significant land ownership by the Department of State Lands, which holds the bed and
Hmm.
banks of rivers like the Willamette in the public trust. Um, and then you might have a county bridge that crosses the river, and they have some land in some cases. So you could really end up with a patchwork or fairly local sites that are relatively small that are owned by one entity, with the rest of it being owned by another.
Hmm.
Um, and so in these cases, we found at times, not always, but at times, entities might say, "Well, that's not our space. It's this government's space, and we can't do anything about that." And so you find yourself working through, I guess, the stereotypical layers of bureaucracy to get anybody to respond, versus we just go out there and we clean it up on DSL property, and leave the rest of the upland alone.
Hmm.
Thankfully, with the Department of State Lands, we have a memorandum of understanding at Willamette Riverkeeper between us and DSL that allows us to do cleanups on all of their land up and down the Willamette. So that's been very helpful over the years.
Got it.
Um,
Got it. What about the
with-
city of Portland? Can you talk a little bit about how the city, whether the city has been willing to partner with you
yeah, I
on
think that
cleanups?
yeah, I think the biggest thing with the city has been communication. We've tried, and we're like any other entity in the world. You're focused on a variety of things, but there have been multiple times over the past few years where we have made a real effort to coordinate with the city and try to figure out who can make a decision, and what direction the city wants to go, and that has been a real challenge for
Hmm.
us anyway.
Hmm.
I know there are entities that only do things like volunteer cleanups, and that's all they do from the land. And we've had a little bit of a different approach, as I mentioned earlier, doing a lot of them from the water, because frankly, some of these areas are best accessed in that way. Um, and it's just been tricky getting with the city on some of these issues. Or in the case of you and I walking the Springwater corridor that day, finding contractors that were hired by the city to go in and clean up individual sites,
Hmm.
which again to us was news. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that was just kind of emblematic of how one entity might be doing one thing, and I think we and others have earnestly tried to communicate over time, and that communication has not necessarily been reciprocated. So I think that the upshot from the city of Portland, after saying all of that, is that they have hired some contractors to focus on certain areas along the river, and they're definitely making an effort. And we could talk more about that.
Yeah. Let's return to that later. Um, And I wanna make clear that you provide your own boats, your own dumpsters. This is a completely volunteer effort on your side.
Yeah, yeah, we've had some partnerships that have helped pay for dumpsters a few times, but oftentimes we are the sole entity purchasing the dumpsters, and providing that service. And our canoes and our power boat and those of our volunteers have been engaged in this. Um, and it's depending on where we're at on the river, it's been a real sustained effort over the past few years, to the point where, and this kind of leads up to, the more recent actions we've taken, but people are tired of it. They don't want to go back to sites over and
Mhm.
over and over and over and clean them up.
Yeah.
And they are looking for better solutions than that. And that's not to
Yeah.
say we're going to stop that, but there's a certain fatigue both with our staff and certainly with our volunteers. As much as we all believe in the need to do that, it's exceedingly frustrating to not find a more permanent fix for this issue.
Absolutely. And so, given this lack of a fix on the part of the city of Portland and other entities, and the increasing amount of trash you were finding, you submitted a petition a year ago to the DEQ, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, asking the agency to set a garbage standard for the river under the Clean Water Act. You also submitted data on your trash cleanups. Can you talk a little bit more about this petition and data and what you were hoping to gain with this petition?
You bet. So the petition under the Clean Water Act was basically Willamette Riverkeeper asking the state of Oregon to regulate trash under that federal environmental law. In our case, the state of Oregon, through the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, administers the Clean Water Act on behalf of the federal government. Um, in this case, because of lack of accountability, frankly, across the board in many cases, nobody really taking a stand to deal with this problem at a scale that would solve it. And you might even make this, something that's statewide. We said, well, they regulate trash under the Clean Water Act on the Anacostia River between Washington, D.C. and Maryland. And they do the same thing in the Los Angeles basin and the Los Angeles River proper. Why
That's right.
can't we ask the state of Oregon to regulate trash under the Clean Water Act on the Willamette? And what that would involve is like other water quality standards or related standards. In this case, instead of saying you could have X amount of allowable bacteria or heat being discharged into the Willamette River proper, it would set a standard for trash for both in water and along the riverside to not exceed a certain threshold.
Got it.
So basically, you're drawing a line and saying this is the highest amount of trash that we will take. If you break that threshold, then you're violating a water quality standard that is enforceable under the Clean Water Act. And
Hmm.
our hope
And
there was to try to drive the conversation to a higher level, uh, to talk about the real level of investment that it's going to take to deal with the houseless problem, to help local jurisdictions deal with that problem, um, and to provide everything that surrounds that in a much more direct and forceful way. And when I
right,
say
because
forceful,
it would be up to those local jurisdictions to actually do the cleanups to reach the standard.
exactly. Yeah. So if you're a local jurisdiction or any landowner and you have people living on your property adjacent to the river, you would have the ability to say, you know what, you need to go camp somewhere else. And in our view, that's the type of thing that would prevent this very direct problem with the Willamette. But we were also careful to say in our petition and elsewhere that, in order to do that, you need other options for folks who are, frankly, and in some cases, they're in harm's way and they're living in a manner that you might say is in harm's way at a number of levels.
Right.
We need to make sure that they have clear alternatives and not just to turn them out and send them elsewhere in kind of a thoughtless fashion. So we thought that elevating this discussion to the Clean Water Act and having the state take a more direct role in that way could be helpful. As
Mhm.
it turned out, the state, they just didn't understand and weren't sure about what to do about that. And they wanted us. The reply to us was, "No, thank you. You didn't write the rule for us, therefore we're not going to accept this petition." Um, and they wanted. We had some conversations with them. but it didn't go, to a place where we felt we needed to be. So
Hmm.
I think it's so. In context with that, we did a data submission under the Clean Water Act. Every 2 years, the state does a call for new data that might indicate a waterway is violating water quality standards, or maybe a problem exists, in this case, where standards do not at present exist. So we submitted a bunch of data to the Oregon DEQ back in April, and we're hoping that that data will be enough for them to say, you know what, perhaps it does make sense for us to regulate trash and related debris under the Clean Water Act.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
right
and
now we're engaging in that.
I should add that I did speak to the DEQ about this petition and the data, and they confirmed what you said, that they rejected the petition due to the language, that it wasn't correct. But they did say that the DEQ agrees with Willamette Riverkeeper that trash is becoming a major problem in the Willamette, because of this influx of encampments along the river, and that they are looking at this trash data that you submitted, and might incorporate it into their into the report that they have to submit to the EPA every 2 years,
Yeah.
and might help set this uh, standard under this other process. So there's hope for that, and it sounds like the agency is acknowledging that there's a problem, that they know that there is a problem.
And that's great. And, it's not unlike other things we've seen where you ask them once and they find a reason to maybe wiggle out of the situation, for lack of a better descriptor. But then, in the face of continued issues, they might come to the table. I think one thing that the DEQ has done over time, and sometimes this is viewed in the state of Oregon, is a great thing about the state of Oregon is having a bunch of folks sit around at the table and talk about half steps to really deal with the problem, and then end up with a solution that really isn't a solution. And I think that's been our mode of operation now for at least a couple of decades since I've been doing this work at Willamette Riverkeeper. And I think it's time to call the question. I mean, I think we need an agency that is robust and vigorous enough to say, you know what, we're on firm ground here with the Clean Water Act. We are enforcing this law on behalf of the federal government, and we have a real problem here with trash and debris that we need to deal with.
Hmm.
And if they would get to that point without it taking years and years, um, I think that would be a real step forward. And again, in tandem with that, you've got to have proper investment in all of the things that would keep people from living along the Willamette and in other natural areas.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't just move people, sweep people out, because they tend to come back to the same areas anyway. So it's
Well,
kind of counterproductive.
yeah, and it kind of gets you to the new rule by the city of Portland, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I want to come back to this later, but the city has been taking all sorts of actions. Some are pretty controversial. And before we talk about the new daytime camping ban, I want to talk a little bit about what we found on the river that day. Which is the contractors that you mentioned. These were folks from CORE, which is a nonprofit formerly known as the City of Roses Disposal and Recycling. It's a company that's doing post sweep cleanups for the city. And I was impressed by the fact that they had a mental health person alongside the cleanup crew. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to say about that encounter. You mentioned it was a surprise that we met these folks there.
Yeah, no, I would love to talk about them for a second because I thought they were great, and having folks there who are interacting with houseless folks who have also formerly been in that position, at least in a couple of cases. I think it says something about that type of contractor going in and having proper training to interact with folks when they might encounter them in these sites where they're sites that have been posted and sites that they're coming back to clean up. Um, so I think that's actually a positive thing. Um, and I think the biggest disconnect though is when you have organizations and or a city devoting resources to the same thing. We need coordination and we need communication. And again, I think that was another good example of where that is lacking.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely.
And I would also say we're just a piece of this, and I'm not pretending that my small nonprofit is the solution, but I think we have a significant niche that's pretty important in this overall issue.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like you need more coordination from the city and communication. You and probably all the other organizations that are working on this.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there was a recent example where we had a cleanup planned, and another organization had a cleanup planned, and we both became aware that the city was going in the day before and dealing with the same area. And that's not to say there wouldn't still be things to clean up, but it's that type of communication that would be very helpful to have.
Mhm. For sure. For sure. Um, let's talk a little bit about the daytime camping ban. So, as we mentioned, city policies have shaped where people can camp and when, and they continue to change over time. Uh, and they've also, shaped where people can seek shelter other than the street. Uh, and one of the things that homeless advocates have mentioned to me is that the sweeps that have been happening all over the city, uh, they move people around from place to place, but they've also led to people seeking out these more remote natural areas because they're kind of out of sight. And, being swept again and again and having to move your encampment is not a good thing for people. Homeless advocates say it really traumatizes people to have to uh, pick up and leave and start over. And this happens over and over and over again. So the city policies have basically kind of pushed people to go farther off the grid, off the sidewalks, and down into the riverbanks. And I'm wondering what you feel about this camping ban, the daytime camping ban, which also prohibits people from camping anytime, day or night, in natural areas.
Yeah, I have not been in the thick of that discussion in regard to the proponents and the opponents of that proposal. Over the past month, I've certainly heard a bit about it, and it does seem to me, as you have said, there's a likelihood that people will seek out areas that are harder to um, enforce that type of ban. And I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to think about where folks might go uh, in order to not have enforcement catch up to them. And those would be our natural areas typically. They're hard to get to. You can have a bit of cover and relative privacy in these areas, even in the urban areas. So I think that we do run the risk of having more people seek out these areas. Um, and at the same time, just from a non trash and debris standpoint, I think there is an element of trauma and almost a type of it's maybe an approach that is a little rough. I wish we had a better. I think we need to explore the connections to the alternatives in tandem with this enforcement. And I think there has been discussion of some of this, in terms of how do we thoughtfully direct people to areas where they can reside for more than one night inside and have that take place. And I think that's a piece of their approach here. So I don't think we need to, I think we need to be cognizant of that part of it as well.
Hmm.
Um, but I think this discussion has to be, if you're not able to uh, have daytime camping in public spaces, sidewalks, and everything else, we have to also say, and we are making a very concerted effort to help people understand where they can go and where they can be safe.
Hmm. Absolutely. Uh,
And frankly, safety is an issue both when you're camping out along the river or in some of the other areas we've seen, whether it's along a freeway or a riverway.
yeah,
And safety can also be an issue in some of the areas where we have directed people to camp over time. So
right.
I think that needs to be a real um, consideration in all of this.
Yeah. Are there any other policies or anything else that, from your perspective as a river keeper, the city could do or implement to help this situation? To help both protect the river and protect the people who are forced to live alongside it.
Well, I think there's an element of helping to continue to create safe access and healthy habitat all along the river. And, there is a real place for uh, advocates that care about water quality and habitat and the natural world, um, that can be in tandem with, finding thoughtful solutions to this type of a problem that we've been talking about. But I think the city honestly needs to invest more in the Willamette. There's been a bit of backtracking over the past few years, and boy, I honestly at this point in time I couldn't tell you uh, one person on city council who is a real advocate for the Willamette and for safe river access in the city of Portland.
Hmm.
And that's kind of a side issue related to the city and its level of investment in green infrastructure and in curbing stormwater. I think we have to get back to some of the key elements that have historically made Portland different in a good way, and investments that people generally agree on that make sense and that
Mhm.
help us have less stormwater infiltration into the sewer system that then in turn can create sewage overflows that we still see today. They are
Mhm.
far less numerous, but they still exist. Um, so I think, this, while people have been distracted by COVID, and a lot of other demands on their time and their financial resources, I think we need to get back to some of the real staples of, you know, keeping Portland vibrant and green and, full of some of the best urban river water that can be found in the United States. And I think we've fallen off of that quite a bit.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think this is a good place to stop our conversation. I agree that, Portland has to get back to its reputation as a green city and has to live up to it. And you know, everyone will benefit from that. Travis, this has been a really important conversation, and I appreciate your compassion and thoughtfulness. We're going to be following this topic closely in the Oregonian and on Oregon Live. And there'll be a package of stories coming out soon about these issues, including impacts on the river. So I'm going to drop a few links and stories in the show notes for you today. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It helps us find the show. Please help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this is with a subscription to Oregon Live, and you can do that at oregonlive.com/pod support. Until next time.